To Aloud. This is a very exciting program this evening, and it is Aloud with the LA Phil Insight. I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Public Programs of the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. Before we begin tonight's program, in the spirit of reconciliation, the Los Angeles Public Library, LA Phil Arts, and Skylight recognize and acknowledge the first peoples of this land. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend our respect to all Indigenous peoples today. Before I go any further with this introduction, I'd like to thank our partners, Julie Ward and her colleagues at the LA Phil Arts, and Michael Chin and the entire staff of Skylight Books. This evening would not be possible without you, so thank you. This compelling program is the last of the Aloud programs this season. We'll be back in January with a terrific lineup. Just to wet your whistle, there are a few guests that I'll be mentioning that will be actually hosting in the spring. Amor Tolles, Leslie Jameson, Tommy Orange, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Sheila Hetty. These are just a few names off the top of my head, even though I wrote them here. But there are many others. We'll be beginning a new chapter of Aloud with both conversation and cabarets, and bringing Aloud to branches around Los Angeles in collaboration with the Los Angeles Public Library. To learn more about Aloud, please go to lfla.org/aloud. But also know that we are not going to post the new season until probably the first week in January. Every day in Mexico, women die by femicide, a hate crime wherein a woman is murdered because she is a woman. In 2019, Cristina Rivera Garza traveled from her home in Texas to Mexico City in search of an unresolved criminal file. The file of her sister Liliana Rivera, who was murdered on July 16th, 1990, knowing that there was only a slim chance of recovering the file. Cristina, inspired by feminist movements across the world and enraged by the global epidemic of femicide, embarked on a path toward justice. Someone says Liliana, and then stops sobbing. Someone says Liliana is no longer with us. This is a moment that Yoel belongs to. Rivera Garza, this is a quote that I should preface this. I didn't have this in my notes, but that actually is from the book. And I found this in the New York Review of Books, and I thought it was a sort of beautiful way to kick off this conversation between them. So I'll begin again. Someone says Liliana and then stop sobbing. Someone says Liliana is no longer with us. This is the moment that Yoel belongs to. Rivera Garza does not yet know that the tears, like grief itself, will change in quality and meaning. Years later, she finds herself crying when she rises out of the swimming pool one day, realizing with shock and gratitude that the water is a place she can be with her long-dead sister. Liliana will reside here with me as long as I plunge into the water, when I stroke and kick and breathing becomes fleshed memory. Cristina Rivera Garza is an award-winning author of The Taiga Syndrome and the Iliac Crest, among many other books, a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, and this, I'm going to butcher this, and forgive me because I have no Spanish accent, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize. Rivera Garza is an MD Anderson Distinguished Professor in Hispanic Studies and the Director and PhD program in Creative Writing in Spanish at the University of Houston. Ceci Bastida is a Latin Grammy nominated musician, songwriter, recording artist, host of Punk in Translation, and activist. Formerly part of the bands Tijuana No, Julieta Venegas, and Morrissey instead of Mexercy, and now works as a solo artist and has a new album, Everything Taken Away. An advocate of immigration reform and prison abolition, she partners with Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights as a child advocate and with Revolve Impact as a musical activist. Please welcome to the stage Cristina Rivera Garza and Ceci Bastida. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to start this conversation with Cristina. You're going to read a little bit of your book, right?
Okay. We'll do that. Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you, Ceci. It's wonderful meeting you finally.
I know, it's so great meeting you too.
I've known her as a singer and as a dweller of Tijuana.
Exactly.
A place that I love, I really love. So I'm very happy to be in your company today.
I know, we have a lot of friends in common, which is really nice.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
yes.
Absolutely, yeah. So, this Liliana's Invincible Summer is an exploration of the femicide of Liliana Rivera Garza, my younger sister, which occurred on July 16 of 1990. I was finally able to write this book in part because I finally gathered the courage to open the boxes where we had placed Liliana's belongings. I was looking for some address book, some kind of information that might lead me to Liliana's old friends from her university years. And I ran into this rich archive, this series of documents, papers that Liliana had written and preserved. So I got to read letters and notes and postcards and the kinds of things that we now put together, I don't know, in Twitter or Facebook, right? And I want to begin this conversation by reading a section of one of these letters. I want you to be very close to Liliana's own voice and to hear some of the inflections, the rhythm, the way in which she put ideas together. So and then after that, we'll continue with the conversation, all right? So, this is the last page of my notebook. Well, the first one from back to front, you know what it means, depending on how you look at it, because it is a matter of thinking young. It is a matter of thinking positively, a matter of focus. Don't you like that ad? Oh, well, I do. I am in such a completely lazy mood, and I am very sleepy too. And when you suffer from those two conditions, but nevertheless, you also have an aversion to sleep during wake hours, there is this very big shock. And do you know what happens? Well, in addition to sleepiness and laziness, a very funny foolishness crops up. This is happening to me right now. So much so that you even feel like sitting down or laying down or kneeling just about anywhere. And then it just so happens that you inevitably start thinking, and you turn to look at the clock on the wall, and you think that your mother is going to arrive soon, and that you have to pay your school tuition bill, and that today you didn't see Angel, and you don't feel like training. You also think that you no longer want to train because when you are not in a quiet environment, it is impossible for you to develop your concentration and full physical potential. And you think that your exams are almost here, and above all, you worry. But your worry is not big enough for you to get up, grab your notebook, and study, right? Well, something similar happens when you're like this, because it is something exactly like that, huh? And if you don't know how to express what you are thinking, then something happens that seems very strange to you. It is something like wondering if you are really the one who is writing, as if, and suddenly, as if by magic, you remember a dream, and as soon as it arrives, it just goes away and you forget it. And you're even more sleepy now, and more, and ouch, your back itches. You scratch with fury because it bothers you that you can't scratch comfortably. Geez. And you wonder why they put so much chlorine in the pool. It makes my skin so very dry. And dryness is not the worst, but what dry skin gives off, itching. So you keep on thinking about the swimming pool and the chlorine, which in addition to the itching, leaves a characteristic smell of the so-called substance whose chemical symbol is Cl. And then you remember your chemistry class and something else as a result, but it is nauseating and you prefer to leave it in peace. Peace, damn. What if there was peace? What if there were no people starving in the world? What if there were justice? What if people really appreciated other people for who they are and not for what they look like or their image? What if I fall asleep? What if you knew what would become of me?
That's beautiful. That was really beautiful.
Thank you.
So I read your book. I started with the Spanish version, and then I decided to read the English version, which I heard was slightly different, and then I realized that you basically wrote both versions. That you didn't hire somebody to translate it. Why did you decide to do it yourself?
It was an interesting and difficult decision, and at the same time a natural one. I've been living in this country for so many years, and even though I teach in English and I lead a bilingual life, I've been writing most of my work, my creative work in any case, in Spanish. I've done some work originally in English, but that kind of work I've kept as a secret in some drawer and in my desk. And I've never felt the urge to publish that. But when I started to write this book, I think I needed some emotional protection, some kind of distance to be able to grapple, to really work with those materials, with Liliana's materials. And so in a very natural way, I began writing in English some of the sections, and then I would sit down to my desk some other day, and then I would write in Spanish some other sections. And so at the beginning, I was fighting that method of work until I decided that this is how this book was going to be written. So I just followed the process as it happened. And what I did later is that I used English to check, to revise my Spanish versions, and I used Spanish to check also my English, the sections that I had written in English. And so I think I can truly say that this book was written in a translation mode rather than in English or in Spanish solely. I think I needed both of them working together, facing each other continuously. But I think that it finally happened that way because I needed that protection. And there were zines and memories that was much easier for me to enunciate them in English than in Spanish. And it helped the process in any case, yeah.
That's so interesting. Also, the other thing is that I realized, obviously, that you decided to write this book a little over 29 years, or 29 years after you lost your sister. Why did you decide to, like, what happened that you weren't able to write it before, or you weren't thinking about writing it before?
It is so hard to answer that question. It's an apparently simple question, but you as a singer, as a songwriter, you know this so well. Projects begin so many times. There is not one single decisive moment in which you say, this is it. At least in my experience, is I'm working on something. I'm usually working in several projects, and I'm not so sure which one eventually will become a book or a long-term project as such. And in this case, I had wanted to write this book before, many, many years ago. and I have failed miserably at writing this book. I now think, looking back, that it didn't work for me because I was working mostly in fiction, and I was trying to recreate, to kind of invent Liliana's voice, and I was failing at it. In fact, I have like 2 drafts. I tried it. I mean, I was serious about the goal. I really wanted to do it, and I have 2 horrible books there. Recently, well, not recently, like some 4 or 5 years ago, I was thinking, well, perhaps they're not that bad. I'm gonna go back to them, and perhaps I can rescue them. And I shared these drafts with my husband, and he read them, and he said, well, I love you. Please don't publish these. You know? And so that's when I realized that he really loves me. I mean, it was not the kind of work that you want to share with others.
Right.
It was just my attempt at getting at a very painful subject, right? So I had tried and I had failed. I had, of course, tried over the years to reopen the case. I had thought about, hiring a lawyer, hiring a detective, and trying to get the perpetrator in jail. As I explained in the book, right after the femicide, Ángel González Ramos, who was Liliana's ex-boyfriend, by then ran away and has remained at large ever since. So he was never tried, even though there is still an arrest warrant against him. So that's something that I've been considering for a long time. And then, so these are different ways of getting into the project, right? So, and then, the pandemic hit. And this sense of urgency just got to me. I was thinking that, as many of you, I'm assuming, thinking that, the possibility of dying. And I thought, well, if I'm gonna die, there is something that I really need to do before that happens. I need to write that book. I cannot leave this world without writing that book. So that's when I started to really sit down and revise those old drafts and try to see what other strategies I could use. But I really think that without Liliana's own archive, without those documents, those letters, those blueprints, I would have never been able to write this book. So that's, I guess, one of the strongest departure points for the book. Yeah.
When you started writing it, and when you were doing the fiction version, did you have access to those? Had you seen the boxes?
No, not at all.
Oh, so this was all.
Yeah, so I think that was a major difference. I was trying to recreate scenes, with Liliana in mind, about my family. I think I was more focused on my own grieving process than on her world as such, and I think that's the reason why those drafts didn't work that well. And so when I finally got to her voice, which is mischievous and humorous and so present, so vivacious as well, that's and then I said, this is it. This is the book, and I finally sat down and started the writing process.
And you think that the fiction, the approach that you had first, was a way to protect yourself instead of writing a nonfiction book?
Yeah, I don't know. It might be true. I think that was a writer that I was at that point in time. Over the years, I think I've taught myself how to write this book. I wrote fiction for a long time, never a very traditional fiction, but texts that are more comfortable within the limits of fiction writing. And over the years, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the limits of fiction as such. So I started to think about issues of disappropriation and about how to incorporate other people's experiences and voices in my own writings, and what kind of ethical implications this fusion or this weaving of voices entailed. And I didn't know that I was, in fact, training myself to write this, which is a cross-genre work. It's fiction and it's nonfiction, and it is weaving, you know, both in specific ways. So I guess the answer to that question would be that's I was writing with what I knew, with the tools I had at hand at that point, and those tools were not flexible enough. They were not what I needed to write this book.
Right. You also talk in the book about knowing that Liliana's boxes were in your family home forever, and you saw them, but you never really touched them. And then, when did you decide to actually open them? And then what happened? Because there's something very interesting about opening something that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to somebody that you lost, and touching these letters, and knowing that she touched them, and knowing that she took the time to write them, as we heard earlier, she was a great writer. What did you learn from her? Like, what surprised you about her?
Well, and this is another beginning of the book as well. As I said, I was just looking for information, and what I found was way more than that.
Yeah.
I was touching at pieces of paper that Liliana had touched 30 years before that day. I traveled from Houston, where I live now, to Mexico City, and then to Toluca, where my parents live, and then I said, well, I have to do it now. So we brought the boxes down, and I opened them. I started reading these papers in a voracious way. I was just going through them like that, one after the other, really surprised. And then it was the sensation that Liliana was there was quite overwhelming, the sense of presentness. And it was not just a metaphor. Liliana had touched those papers. I was placing my hands on those same papers, and so, you know, we leave traces of ourselves on things that we touch, and since those papers have remained untouched for all these many years, I really felt that I was in contact with her, materially speaking, and so. At that point, I didn't know this exactly as I'm going to be sharing this with you right now, but that became the challenge, the aesthetic challenge for me as a writer. I wanted, unfortunately, the story is very well known. Unfortunately, the number of femicides keeps on growing. But what we know little about is the life stories of these women that we lose. And so I wanted to share with readers was precisely that sensation, that Liliana was present, that presentness, that the possibility of her own existence close to me, close to all of us. So that was another beginning also of the book, more the methodological beginning of the book, if you want to call it that way,
Yeah.
you know, the formal aspect of the book.
So we know, everybody knows, unfortunately, that Mexico has had violence, gender-based violence, and it became sort of famous in the 90s with the murders of hundreds of women and girls in Ciudad Juarez, in Chihuahua. And then we know now, as you mentioned a second ago, that 10 women are killed in Mexico every day, as of like 2018, I think. And when this happened to Liliana, there wasn't the word femicide. You mentioned this in the book as well, that there was not the proper language for it, and they used to call it crimes of passion. And now it's femicide, or it's been femicide for a few years now. Can you tell us the difference between those two terms, and why it is important for us to have the right language and the right words for this kind of crime?
Well, one of the difficult things about writing this book is that because it is difficult to write against patriarchy in the language of patriarchy, right? So you have to do something to language in order to be able to tell this story from the perspective of women, not necessarily the perspective of the perpetrators. And one of the challenges that I very consciously tackled was the need to subvert those narratives, those very powerful narratives that essentially blame women and exonerate the perpetrators again and again. Every time that people ask when listening to news of femicides, when people ask, well, where was she? Was she drinking? Did she have other boyfriends? Those are questions that imply guilt, that imply that the victim is responsible for the violence that has been exercised against her. And this way of thinking is very well rooted in another very powerful narrative, the one of passionate crime, which is actually a legal figure. Historians of the 19th century, of the 20th century, have investigated, have gone through tons of files, and what they have come up with is information. So now we know for sure that the figure of the passionate crime has been used to exonerate men and violent men specifically, and so very often they are not tried, or they are las ¿cómo se llama? Las condenas. Yeah, the sentences are very light for them because it is believed that a man, when he is out of his mind, is not responsible for his actions. And what this implies, obviously, is that gender violence is somehow sporadic or extraordinary instead of structural. And so when we say the word femicide, which now is a legal definition, right? What we are saying is that this is a structural type of violence stemming from inequality, of gender inequality as such.
Right. And so in the beginning of the book, you're talking about you go to Mexico City and you go to an office and then you talk to somebody and then this person tells you you have to go to a different office and then you have to go to a different office, which is very common in Mexico in anything that you try to do there. And I've lived in Mexico City for, well, I don't live there anymore, but I lived there for several years, and I know that going through the city can be a nightmare. Yeah. And it dissuades anybody from, pursuing whatever you want to achieve. Do you feel like there's a sense that the authorities are doing this in a way to sort of, for you to leave it alone? Like, is there a strategy that they're doing or that they're creating so that you are like, give up, right? It's so exhausting. The fact that it was so hard for you to get a case file is kind of incredible.
And it is very common, unfortunately. So what I came to learn starting in 2019 is what many Mexican families have experienced over the years, right? Very often you have to run your own investigation, hire your own detectives. You have to invest, your own resources to be able to develop a case. And yeah, you get tired, and it's very exhausting and very frustrating. And so it was, for me, it was really, really important too. And this is another beginning of the project. Just realizing that some of these cases, like there was a very famous case, the Lesbi Garcia case, that had this lawyer, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name, Sayuri Herrera, a really good lawyer, had taken that case and was able to achieve a really good sentence for the perpetrator. So just learning that and realizing that culturally we were creating the words, the concepts, to be able to identify clearly this kind of violence and therefore to protect ourselves and future generations for this kind of violence, all that allowed me to, it was the world telling me, now it is the time to write your book. Now you have an audience for this book. Now there are ears able to listen to these kinds of stories.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it seems that it has taken so long for women in Mexico specifically to organize and demand change and justice? Why are things happening now and then things that weren't happening before?
Well, Ceci, I had, there is a very strong, very lively feminist movement in Mexico and throughout Latin America right now. And I think it is thanks to that, to those kinds of mobilizations that have taken public space over, but also public language, that now we have a different vocabulary to refer to these situations that very often go unnoticed. So I don't know if it has taken us too long because patriarchy is really strong. And because you have to fight with others and organize with others in order to be able to confront this patriarchy. It's a huge enemy. That's what I mean to say.
Yeah, I think I also wanted to talk. I think you mentioned catcalling in the book for a little bit, and I was thinking about my own experience growing up in Tijuana, and I remember from a very early age, I knew that if I was walking, I would not look men in the eye. I would definitely not smile, and there was a sense that I wasn't fully free. But nobody told me, don't do that. Don't look at people in the eye. It was just somehow I kind of understood it.
Yeah,
I understood it because you walk and people are yelling at you. So I guess the question is also how much of this is cultural, because we know that still in Mexico in a lot of cases, for example, if you're married, divorce is not an option, or this idea that you sort of have to endure anything in order to keep a family together. Also this phrase that we hear forever, and hopefully not so much anymore, where it's like, calladita te ves más bonita, you're prettier when you're quiet. And family dynamics also, the sister, hey, serve your brother the dinner, he shouldn't do it himself.
Or you have to wash the dishes, right?
Wash the dishes. Then there's religion also. And television, telenovelas, that are playing almost like it seems like 24 hours a day in the main TV stations. How much of this do you think is cultural?
Well, I would have to say, though, that you've been referring to Mexico.
Yes.
And it is true. But the situation in other countries and the relation and what is happening in other countries in terms of femicides and in terms of gender violence is equally worrisome. In the United States, 3 women are killed on a daily basis by their intimate partners. And 3 is not 10, but it's 3 women.
Right.
And these are tragic numbers. There is obviously there is a cultural aspect to it, and I would say there is a structural aspect to it too. I mean, we need to have equality in terms of education, access to labor conditions, good salaries, in order to be able to protect women. We need to have equal access to public space. You were mentioning, we learn what not to do. We learn very early what places of the city we should avoid. We learn not to be free in many ways. And this happens both in Mexico, in Latin America, but I would argue that that is the case also in the United States. So we're facing a powerful enemy. Yes. And we have to fight that with as many resources as we can.
Yeah, I remember also when I first was traveling to Spain many, many years ago, and I would read the paper and I would see a lot of stories about women getting killed there. And I thought, and I wasn't so aware what was happening in Mexico at the time, I'm talking about years ago. And I thought, wow, why is this happening so much here, without realizing that this was happening forever in the country that I lived in. So that was very
Something that
scary.
I think contributes to prevent a conversation, a real conversation about gender violence to happen in the United States is that, in fact, we lack that language too. If you say the word femicidio in places like Mexico or Latin America, you know exactly what it means. And there is a political reaction to it as well. If I say the word femicide in this country, not a lot of people would know exactly what it means. And we have in Spanish the word for the feminicida, for the killer, right? But in English, we still are grappling with the use of the word femicider. Not long ago, a translator, Max Granger, was trying to translate a piece that I wrote for El País, and the piece was about el feminicida. And he decided to use the word femicider, which is weird in English, to say the least, right? But I thought it was perfect. That's the word that we need to use in order to be able to convey the structural nature of this violence. Well, long story short, the publishers decided that femicider was a weird concept, and they changed the word femicider for killer. But a killer is a more general concept, right? A femicider is a type of killer. Is a killer that attacks, targets women because they are women. And so we need that specificity in order to think properly, critically about the conditions that lead to gender violence. And so the relationship between language and action, language and reality, daily life, what we can do, I think is really important. And it's clearly also political.
Yes. So now that we're talking about this, I wanted to talk to you, or I wanted you to tell us a little bit about las tesis. And I don't know if people know who las tesis are and what they've done. So we decided that we have a video that we want to show you, and then we'll start talking about them. Should we explain a little bit before? So Las Tesis is a group of women that started in Chile, and they created this performance back in 2020 where they're talking about basically violence against women. And so they did this performance that was recreated in many countries. But we wanted to show just a little bit so people would understand what we're talking about.
Que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que no ves. El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que ya ves. Es femicidio. Impunidad para mi asesino. Es la desaparición. Es la violación. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. El violador eras tú.
Well, can you imagine, for someone who had been thinking about gender violence for a long time without being able to truly put this in words, to express this clearly, the first time that I heard that, it was November 25th of 2019, if I'm not mistaken. But I was just totally, absolutely taken by it. Mi piel se puso chinita. I was just, it was electricity in my back. It was just, wow. It's like, I realized then that we already have the language as a society. We have been able to develop that specific vocabulary that might allow us to say those things. And then we could understand that very clearly too. And we can be empathetic also.
I found that it was like, obviously the writing seems quote unquote simple, but it's so accurate. And when I also saw the performance, I was very moved, and at the same time, I felt like it described women's experiences in Latin America and in the world so perfectly that when you included the lyrics or part of the lyrics in your book.
Yeah.
And so I really was surprised by it, but it makes total sense. So I just wanted people to see it.
And in many ways, this is another beginning of the project, right? Just in trying to find the right words, the right strategy, the structure of the book, and then suddenly there is this thing in many languages, translated in I don't know, many languages, and then just realizing, hey, the language is already there. You know, the scenario is there. We're having this conversation. I can participate in this conversation. We belong there. We belong together. I think that's what prompted me.
Yeah,
in
and
that-
you're
in
not
that case.
alone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a mention in your book where you talk about going back to the term femicide and what happened back, I don't know if it's more than 30 years at this point, that you and your family had decided not to talk about what happened to Liliana at that time as much, and that there was a sense of shame and guilt. Can you talk about those feelings?
I don't know if it was a conscious decision. It was not something like we said, let's not talk about
Right.
that. But it was a silencing, a forced silencing of a very painful experience. It was like a catch-22. Damn if you speak about it, damn if you don't. It was, of course, very difficult to convey the story of Liliana in ways that were respectful to her, in ways that might allow listeners to understand her point of view. So when this story was told, it was captured within this narrative, the narrative of the passionate crime, right? And so we didn't want to talk about that. But then not talking about that multiplied the sense of shame, of betrayal. And that's what society teaches us when we don't have the language, when we lack the language, right? And the less you talk about it, the greater the guilt, the greater the shame, the greater the paralysis too, and the sense of isolation. And so, and that's the reason why there is a major focus in the book about language, about having access to these words, to these concepts.
Right. So if you had this language back then, it would have been probably easier. Yeah. When you were investigating, when you were doing all this investigation, was there a moment where you felt unsafe? Or I ask only because I know of many people in Mexico, because we were just talking about Mexico, that are looking for the truth of what happened to their loved ones, and they face intimidation, sometimes even more. Sometimes they get killed. Was there ever a moment that you felt unsafe, or that you had to be extra careful with who you were speaking with or what you were doing?
You know, when I began the research, I was very naive. I thought, I'll go to the General Attorney's office, I'll be in touch with some lawyers, I'll hire a detective, I'll do whatever I can. And very soon I realized that I was getting into very slippery territory. And that I had to be very careful, not only for myself, but also for my family. Yeah. So yeah, there was plenty of that. We had to move, you had to move into different houses. We had to, we had to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we didn't know what we were dealing with. The killer, the femicider, now we can use that word here, the femicider was never found, so we didn't know what had come of him. We didn't know if he had become, if he had died, or if he had become, I don't know, a major like criminal.
Right.
We had no idea, and we were moving those all that energy. We were asking questions. We were getting close to the places where his family lived, where Liliana had lived. So you never know what could happen.
Yeah.
And there were many occasions in which I felt compelled to, protect, especially my parents, my family. Yeah, you have to be very careful with these things.
Yeah. So I think we are ready for some questions. Is that right? And somebody's going to be walking around with a microphone. So does anybody have any questions?
Because we can talk forever right
I
here,
know.
right? Yeah, we can continue. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Fernanda,
Thanks.
the one who sends you emails.
Fernanda. Hi, Fernanda. How are you?
Hi,
Yeah, nice
good.
meeting you, Fernanda. Yeah.
Nice meeting you. I'm a doctoral student. I do my research on feminicide, and your book has been seminal to my work. So first of all, it's really personal. So I do appreciate a lot, like this gift you've given us to Mexican women and women all around. And I do have some questions, too many, but I will keep it short. So the first one is, I've noticed, I've seen you in other events, and the abstract of the book that you start with is this last question about like, ¿qué pasaría si supieras qué va a ser de mí, right? And this always brings me back to this archive also as indexical of the life of the victims. And thinking about, I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Mara Fernanda. She was from Puebla in 2017, and she wrote this tweet. She tweeted, if they kill me, they are going to say that I was drunk. And she was killed 2 weeks after, and they said it was because she was drunk. So I don't know, I see these kind of connections, and Mara Fernanda is just one other very viral case, but I have been interviewing the searching mothers of Sonora. I've in conversations with them, and it's very telling for me how this question of the victim saying, like really stating, so this, like, what will be of me in the future kind of hits us after. And I would, so my question to that is, there's so much focused on the death of the women and so little of life. So how did you like navigate, and because she was your sister, so I imagine like whenever I'm working with this, I really try to hold on to life.
Yeah.
So if you could, I don't know, speak about like how, like, because there's also the death that matters, and how she dies.
Yeah.
And the passive and active language of she was found dead versus she was found killed, and all these things. And my second question is about, so there's a large focus on language in your book, and you have talked about that, having the language, but also there's this part when feminicide has been co-opted, like the concept has been co-opted by the whole system, right? So it gets activated by, so a woman gets killed, and the state needs to negate the feminicide in order for women to take the streets and kind of the political force of feminicide to start working. So I don't know if you have thought about that and the limits also of feminicide in a system that it's been sort of built not to accept it and to dismiss this violence.
Yeah, those are important questions. Let me see. It is very hard also to write about violence. There are many ways of getting the story wrong. you could place so much emphasis on the forces of evil that your main characters are rendered powerless, totally powerless, for example. There is the danger of getting so much into the story as such of the killing that you create pieces of so-called porno violence, right? The banality of evil as well. There are so many ways of getting these stories wrong, and that was especially important for me in this case. I was trying to write the story of my sister's life, right? And I wanted to denounce the femicide. I wanted, obviously, to pay attention to the murder as such. But very soon, in learning Liliana's own materials, I realized that she didn't see herself as a victim. Until the very end, she saw herself as an author of her own life. There were things that she was able to see, and many that she wasn't able to see, precisely because she lacked that language. But until the very last day, it seems to me, the way in which I read her papers, it's very striking even now to think that she was about to be free. She was about to break free. And so I wanted to write a book able to honor that position. Yes, she was in a structural position, in a disadvantage, obviously, in a patriarchal society that allowed very little room for her desires and for her freedom. But at the same time, I wanted people to know her life. I was, in fact, getting to know aspects of her life that I have very little idea about. And you know how that goes. I mean, you live with someone, with your own family, and you know him somewhat well, but there are always things that you learn, about them through other people that come as a surprise. And so, in interviewing Liliana's friends and even members of the family, I came to realize that Liliana was way more humorous than I remember her. That everybody remembered her sarcasm, how ironic she was. I had an idea that Liliana was a good reader. I didn't know how voracious a reader she was. She was studying to become an architect, so I knew that she had interest in visual arts, for example, but I didn't know that she was such a disciplined writer. I think at that point in 1990, when I was starting to write, she was the true writer of the family. That's something that I say in the book, that she was a true writer of the family, because at least judging by the amount of letters that I came to read, she was writing way more than I was writing. At that point, I was a student, I was studying sociology, and I was, I think, more interested in changing the world and writing about that world. But Liliana was writing and experimented with form and having lots of fun doing it, right? And so I was tempted at the beginning to present Liliana as a victim of this macho man. And she was. But she was not only that. She was way more than that. And so I needed to conduct more research, but at the same time, I had to investigate, to play with literary strategies, able to bring that liveliness to the page, right? To bring that aspect of Liliana that was so important for her. I wanted this book to be about her, not about my ideas of who she was. And so I tried to, and I remain, I believe, a very discreet presence in the book, because Liliana had been forcibly silenced. Liliana had been killed. And I didn't want to be complicit in doing that again in the book. And then I wanted also to place emphasis on her life, because very often when we hear these violent stories, we hear data, right? And similarities, the patterns that keep on repeating themselves. We don't hear the story as such, the human story behind all these violent acts. And so I wanted that life to be the center of the book, because Liliana was to be the protagonist of the book, right? And the other thing that I learned in writing in that way is that the challenge for me, I was thinking, what if I'm able to portray Liliana in as complex a way as I can, then it might be possible for others to miss her as much as I do. And missing her, in that case, would be a political act. Would be perhaps a call for further action. Those were the ideas I was entertaining. And as you can see, they were philosophical ideas. They were very practical, concrete, practical concerns as a writer. What to do with sentences? How should I start this paragraph? How could I bring life into this character? But at the same time, I was thinking about a book that would be able to help others to partake of a conversation that I think is one of the most important ones that we are developing right now. Migration on the one hand, and violence, gender violence on the other. Great tragedies of our already very tragic times. And I've always believed that the writing, literature in general, writing specifically, is it's always an invitation for critical thinking. Luckily, for critical practice too. So I was very concerned and interested in creating this artifact able to contribute to that conversation, to make it more complex, more lively too. Yeah, so those were issues that I had to consider very, very carefully as I was writing the book. Thank you.
I think there's somebody else in the front. Oh, question over there. Okay.
Oh, I didn't recognize you. Marco, how are you?
Hi, Cristina. I'm so happy, and it's such a privilege to hear you speak about the book. I'm impressed by the reception that the book has had in the Mexican literary scene, because it seems like this language that you're talking about, it's still missing in some of these critical minds that consider that Mexican literature should look certain way, or should do certain things. My like, this is sort of a conversation that's on top of many conversations that we had with you in the classroom, in the sense that how important is the physical presence of the writer in terms of dealing with the archive. I'm wondering, like, you described so eloquently how this book has enhanced, has transfixed and transformed your writing and your practice into something else, like following your own experimental career in terms of writing and archival work as well, like documentary work. I'm very curious, and very similarly to Fernanda's question, I am very curious about how this book has changed your pedagogical practice. Like, how are you transformed as a professor of creative writing? And especially since this book is so special, not only because it's not the same thing to talk about Matilde than to talk about Liliana. And also because this is sort of like your first bilingual book. Is that what I understand? And so you're reaching both sides of the hateful U.S.-Mexico border.
And of my brain too.
And that too, exactly, your bilingual brain. So I'm very curious. I mean, I know that those are two questions right there, like about the reception of both sides of the border, but also how has it changed your pedagogical practice?
Yeah. It's very interesting that you asked that question because well, for those of you who don't know these, I've been teaching creative writing for a long time now. I was a professor of creative writing at UCSD for 8 years, and I taught in English at that point. And right now I'm running a PhD program in creative writing in Spanish at the University of Houston, and I've been there for 6 years already. Wow, time flies. But interestingly enough, I think many of the questions that led me to write these kinds of books were first generated in many of those workshops. I remember you were part of some of those. I remembered very early during the 21st century discussing issues of materiality, issues about writing with our body, not only with our minds, questioning the conditions of production of texts, asking questions about how a text related back to the reality that in which it was generated in the first place, trying to link formal questions to political questions, and all of those issues were part of central issues in our discussion in these workshops. Many of them alerted me to the possibilities of cross-genre writing. I think that was one of the first issues that came to be really important in my most recent practice. So I'm a historian too by training. And I did write a dissertation about that, so I paid my dues. And exploring the archive has taught me immensely about not only writing, but about human voices, about how to, how slippery it is, how the slippery terrain that you have to cross to bring someone else's experience into your own writing, and the kind of ethical questions that come as a result of that. So what I'm trying to say, Marcos, is that it's not only that this book is now changing the way in which I behave in a classroom, my pedagogy, so to speak, but it was in the first place. That discussion, that possibility that opens up in some classrooms, in some classroom situations, that has allowed me over the years to consider very deeply all these questioning, right? So I do a lot now, just very briefly, I do a lot of work with archives now in my own workshops, and I continue exploring this weaving of different genres. This cross-genre territory is increasingly way more important now in my own writing. I am right now trying to write something that is fiction, and as such, just only fiction. It's so complicated. You cannot go back to fiction, after having written all these other books. And obviously, the fiction that I'm going to end up writing is not going to be, traditional fiction. But I'm looking forward to that process. So, the other thing about the reception of the book, well, I think feminist movements in Latin America are at the center of a discussion that is crucial for our daily lives. Marea Verde in Argentina has been able to transform, to defend reproductive rights. So while we in the United States are continuously losing our rights, we in Latin America are touching the delicate issues and acting upon them. So I think we in the United States have a lot to learn from we in Latin America in this sense. We women in Latin America have a lot to learn from women in the Spanish-speaking world, specifically women who are engaged and involved in feminist, or more generally speaking, women's mobilizations as such. And I think that this discussion about femicide and the femicider in the way in which I talked about earlier, I think it has something to offer too, to that pending conversation in the United States. It is a silent epidemic, as it's been termed often. It is very serious. It's very important. It is happening here and now to a range and a variety of women, and we don't talk enough in the United States about this violence. Not as much as we talk about that violence and we act upon that violence in Latin America. So I think the roles have been transformed in a way. And I think we better start this conversation in more explicit terms. I think we need to identify the danger, and we need to protect also, future generations of women. We need to create safe places, safe relationships, safe and fulfilling and precious and joyful lives too for the future.
One more. Brief, they say.
I'll try to be brief in my answer. I think questions are brief, but then, yes.
My name's Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Thank you so much for writing your book. Must have been incredibly hard.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to make a comment to a question you had. I wonder if these things happen to women in other countries when you and Ceci were discussing at a young age learning to subdue your femininity. I was born and raised first 12 years of my life in Canada, the peace, prosperity, happy country of the world. Mm-hmm. Believe me, it happens there too, and it happened when I was a child. Mm-hmm. My mother didn't teach me to lower my eyes or ignore men or things, but I taught my friends and my sister. So it does go on in other countries, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And to this day in Canada, we have a femicide serial killer that is annihilating Indigenous women in the province of British Columbia. Yeah. So this work and this video from South America was very, very touching. Yeah. Those women are so brave, and so are you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your comment and for sharing that experience. Let me just finish wrapping this up by emphasizing what you just said. And this takes me back to your question too, Marco, about the different reception. I think we need to speak more about what you are just sharing with us. That it is happening here, that it is real, that it is a menace, and that we can have different lives in the future too. So, mentioning the word femicide, openly speaking about femiciders, bringing that word into English, I think it's going to be, is my commitment now. It's something that I realize is incredibly important too. So thank you so much for coming tonight. It's just such a pleasure. And
Gracias.
Thank you. Gracias por la conversación y las preguntas. Thank you
gracias,
so much.
Cristina.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us. You were incredible, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you all for being here. Cristina's book is in the lobby signed. She checked the LA Phil website because she's a dramatist behind a piece of music that will be turned into a ballet in the future, but this piece of music is playing this evening till Sunday, so catch it. And thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you all in the new year, and happy holidays. Take care. Thank you.